Hey there, Pastor Farney again with our sixth lecture on the devotional life. Today our discussion centers around embodied forms of devotional practice. Let's dive in. Now, in the history of Christianity, especially in more Western Christianity, the tendency has been a development further and further away from the body in devotion. Religion has become more and more something that happens inside of your brain. It's a matter of thoughts and ideas and beliefs. But that's not necessarily completely a Christian idea. It probably has more in common with the Gnostics, which are sort of a mysterious Christian heretical sect who were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy rather than Jesus philosophy. They taught that the Christian goal was to transcend the material world and leave this body behind. And I think in some part we fall into the same false teaching, at least a little bit, when we talk about dying and living in heaven forever, because the dominant image of heaven tends to be that we'll leave our wretched bodies behind on earth and become free-floating spirits, or even angels with wings and harps. It's kind of a silly Hallmark image, but it can run pretty deep in us. We think of our bodies as sort of incidental to who we are. That's not who I really am. Who I really am is in here, or maybe in here. And this influences everything from the prevalence of the interest in virtual reality to questions about gender and sex and confusion in those areas, even to death and dying. If my body isn't who I really am, what does it matter what I do with it? How could it determine who I am? It's no more determinative of who I am than the clothes I wear. Now, all those sorts of things are heinously unchristian, and we should do our best to reject them. God created man, body and soul, and God likes it that way. And on the last day, he will raise bodies and reunite them to souls, and the human will be whole again. And now, if that's the Christian hope, and it certainly is, we ought to live like that today. So we should devote not only our minds, but also our bodies to the Lord. As St. Paul says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you? And so embodied practices can help us turn the whole self to God, and often can help shake us out of distractions that are purely mental. Now, I should say, you see on the right side of the screen an image that the PowerPoint suggested. As I type these words, it kind of gives you images and tries to design your slide, and it's much better than I am. But it's got this image of what looks like a guy using prayer beads, and he has probably a little Buddha statue there, which is kind of interesting because it sort of helps illuminate that Eastern-Western split in thought, which kind of ironically runs counter to what many Eastern religions believe about the body. They do believe that the body is bad, it's junk, get out of it as soon as you can, it's just holding you back. But even still, they recognize that it can be very important in devotional practices to try to apply it. At any rate, here are some good examples of some really classic examples of how people have focused the mind by focusing the senses of the body. Now, surely any of you with a Catholic background know about rosaries. And if you've just heard about them, there's nothing particularly wrong with them. What tends to be kind of objectionable is that they're usually associated with prayers to Mary, which there are some things particularly wrong with. But they do have a good idea attached to them. For those of you that have never held a rosary, don't really know the word but don't know what it is. Usually they have 100 little beads on them. They're a little necklace with 100 beads, and you use them to count prayers. So you'll say usually a Hail Mary, and you'll move on to the next bead, and you'll kind of count that way. You'll move it along and say it 99 more times. I suppose you don't have to use a prayer that's not super Lutheran. Some people also do 100 Lord's prayers or some other prayer. But the idea is that your body does the counting while your mind focuses on the prayer. It's really just a counting tool. It also kind of gives your hands something to do. And while I don't personally think such a thing is for me, there's nothing wrong with saying the Lord's Prayer 100 times. And you might try to emulate that practice somehow. If you have trouble knowing what to do with your hands while you pray. If you watch me while I pray in Bible study, a lot of times I'll wring them and unfold them. Don't give me a rosary or I'll end up saying the same prayer 100 times, and no one wants that. Anyway, that's the one that we associate with touch, or at least one example of one. Perhaps a more interesting idea to us and a little less familiar are icons. Now, icons are religious art, especially of Christ or the saints. And the idea is that instead of praying with your eyes closed or something, you use the icons to point you toward God and His work in the lives of His people. Now, this picture you have on your right is the oldest surviving icon. It's in a monastery on Mount Sinai. It's called Christ Almighty. And icons work in quite the same way that, say, the statue at the front of our sanctuary works, or maybe as our stained glass windows work. We use our eyes to remind ourselves that God became incarnate. He's man, not as a character in a book in our minds, but he's a man with eyes and hands and heart. Even today, God has not unincarnated himself. So liturgical art can be very, very helpful in using our eyes to get to our hearts. Here we have one that I think is really fun, a personal favorite, burning incense, another ancient and worldwide practice that I like just because I personally like how it smells. I like the smell of it. Anyway, the point is similar to icons, but now with the sense of smell that helps us focus and remind us that it's a time for prayer, a time for meditation. It centers you, brings you back when you get distracted. Now you could get yourself a home incense kit. I've got my little thing here that I like to light when there's a bad smell around the house. Usually, I should use it more for prayer, but again, I like the smell. But you could even kind of follow this practice with a really strongly scented candle. And something that's really nice about that is kids go crazy for that kind of stuff for a couple of reasons. First, they instinctively know that worship should involve your bodies. It should involve your senses. Also, they love to play with fire. I remember a friend at Camp Lakeview. He had a rule named after him in the rule book the year after he stopped working there. Because every day for Bible study, his third grade boys, for some reason, didn't want to pay attention. So they would start by building a little fire together. And they could all put little sticks on the fire. And as long as they were doing that, their ears were working. They had something to focus on, and they could sit still and be receptive. They had something to look at, something to do with their senses other than get up and run around. And so they could listen and have a little more attention. But second, the strong, really distinct smell, and you'd have to use a candle. You don't burn for other purposes. It gives you that thing to focus on, and it brings you back. It can be a very powerful sense if you use it right. Now we move from the nose to the ears. I have no need to tell you how important music is in worship. I've heard it said, I couldn't track down the study that showed this, but I've heard it said that the best determining factor of whether or not a child will stay in the faith when they grow up is whether or not their dad sings in church. Again, I'm not sure where that data comes from, but there is a lot to be said for the impact of music and song in our lives. You might think about how certain songs can take you back to certain times or places. They can remind you of certain people. I mean, imagine Christmas without our common hymns. It's kind of unthinkable. It wouldn't be Christmas. So how foolish are we if we ignore that power and don't set it to good use. How impoverished we are if we don't fill our ears with music that feeds the soul. And the impact is only more pronounced if you can make that music yourself. I know you can all sing, every one of you, not all to the same caliber, but you're all way too old to be self-conscious about it. So sing to your kids, sing to your grandkids. You owe it to them. It will strengthen their faith, and it will strengthen yours. Now finally, I can't do all the senses without doing taste. And for all the other ways you might try to use taste in your devotional life, of course, the one we should go to first is communion. As the church fulfills God's commandment to taste and see that the Lord is good. Just to reveal my personal preference, I would love if we were able to bake a really nice, pungent, warm, delicious bread for communion, although it's probably no surprise how difficult that might be logistically. Maybe one day. All right, I know today's lecture was a bit shorter than others because the point here is not so much to show you new practices you might try, as I've done on other days, but to remind you about the embodied practices we see in our other weeks. Kneeling to pray, prayer walking, service to the community. And so my encouragement to you this week is to set up a space in your house special for the devotions you do this week. Get a candle and a scent you don't normally smell, set a cross or something together, find some sort of Christian art you keep around the house, maybe even find some meditative music that helps draw you into devotional practice. You might also make yourself a cup of coffee or tea, maybe have a glass of wine if you do your devotions in the evening. Find a way to remind yourself that you have set a time apart, even as all your days and hours are to be set apart for the Lord, because he has set you apart. So find some way to tap into your senses, to make your devotions, whatever else you normally do, feel that much different this week, to draw you out of your normal and draw you close to God. All right, that's all for today. As always, God bless you, and we'll see you next week.